I actually want to start by echoing some of our colleagues, Irene and Laura Stephanie especially, and also Professor Alamin, in that for me it is impossible to think any of the questions of this conference without holding Palestine in my front of mind. And I'm grateful to them for invoking that place and the material bodies that are current targets of colonial violence. So as we're here in some way dedicated to thinking with the decolonizing work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and in this context of a global political moment in which questions of belonging, displacement, and dispossession have urgent, violent, indeed genocidal implications, I want to offer as my contribution to our discussions over these days a few reflections on the notions of ugeni and uenyeji as they emerge in the poetry of Mohammed Khelef Ghassani, and which I have been engaged in translating into English over the last several years. As I mentioned yesterday, I tend to take a long time. Though it's not an obvious comparative exercise, I want to do so in relation to the notions of foreignness and becoming foreign that emerge in some of the writings, speech, and curatorial work of the great American Nobel laureate Toni Morrison. Why bring the work of a novelist who writes in English, whose fiction has been singularly focused on the African-American experience, and in particular, the African-American woman's experience in the United States, into conversation with the formal Swahili verse of a male Zanzibari poet? The immediate answer is that happenstance brought these two sets of writings and aesthetic practices into my frame of view at the same time. As I was finalizing my translation manuscript of Ghassani's award-winning Na Kwetu, Sauti, Mgeni Ugenini, my home institution, the Africa Institute, held a two-day symposium dedicated to the work of Toni Morrison in Sharjah, UAE, where we're located. I was asked to moderate a conversation between Professor Margot Crawford, a scholar of African-American literature at the University of Pennsylvania, and Toni Morrison's son, Ford Morrison, that followed a screening of the film The Foreigner's Home, which Ford co-produced and which focused on an exhibition Toni had curated at the Louvre in 2008 of the same name. In preparing for the task, I learned that her book of essays, The Origin of Others, published in 2017, also included an essay with this same title, The Foreigner's Home. These two titles alone, to which we might add the third in French that the Louvre exhibition was given for a primarily French-speaking audience in Paris, offer a hint at why I found myself interested in how these two artists' thinking might speak to one another. Na Kwetu, Sauti Mgeni Ugenini, The Foreigner's Home, Étranger chez soi. By the time of the Morrison Symposium, I had spent quite a bit of time thinking about Ghassani's title, as a translator must inevitably do. But I was also presenting and writing and even publishing about it, because, among other things, I found the I of Na and the we of Kwetu particularly difficult to preserve in English, even as I found them indispensable to the meaning of the work. To offer an amended quote from my own article on the topic in a special issue in the Journal of the African Literature Association, I perceive, I think I have this, no, I don't have it here, okay. I perceive in Ghassani's title, quote, a simultaneous evocation of place and lineage and a condensed encapsulation of both an individual claim to humanity and human freedom and a situated understanding of collective belonging. For Ghassani, and perhaps I could say from a Swahili sensibility more generally, there is no home without we. Among the tangles in Ghassani's title that I had tried to work out in that article had to do with the title poem's first stanza, in which the fact of having an our place. An our place, right? The belonging and kinship of Kwetu is set up in opposition to the state of the mtumwa, who is msikwao, or without such a place of belonging. I think I might have Ida's problem of how to advance my slides here. Oh wait, I see, okay. Is that? So here's the stanza from the title poem. Nimtumwa msikwao na mikatu hiosie, simo kwenye watu hao, nina kwetu hasa mie. Nako kwa mazalio, kwa makuzi na mabae, jina kwetwa Zanzibar. I won't rehash the entirety of that article's argument here, but understanding this phrasing as emerging from the Swahili adage, mwacha asili ni mtumwa, or in some formulations, mkata kwao ni mtumwa. One of the many ways to make sense of this idea of the mwenye kwao is as the individual who refuses to be sucked up into the gravitational pull of globalization, what Toni Morrison calls in her aforementioned essay, the preeminence of Western culture and economy and the Americanization of the developed and developing world through the penetration of US cultures in the form of fashion, film, music, and cuisine. I had given comparatively less thought to the book's subtitle, Sauti Mgeni Ugenini, but the help of this comparative lens has led me to a secondary realization that in fact, neither is there ugeni nor wenyeji without we. And it is this second and rather more encompassing we that may be somewhat unexpectedly, to my mind now, the more urgent one for us to contend with as readers of Ghassani's poetry. I hope I can make myself clear as I go on. In one of the early moments of Ford Morrison's film, in an interview with Haitian writer Edwidge Danticat that forms much of the backdrop narration for the film, Toni Morrison reflects on the choice of the exhibition's title. In coming up with this theme, she said she was thinking about global migration and the fact that for many there is, quote, no safe harbor. She says, I quote again, the title and subject of this project holds two meanings that are available in English. And this, I think, was the slide before. The foreigner's own home, memory and ancestry, and the foreigner is home, citizenship and belonging. The theme, therefore, requires us to come to terms with being, fearing, or accommodating the stranger. The French title of the exhibition, Étranger chez soi, effectively offered a third meaning, to my mind, implying estrangement within one's own home. For the purposes of this paper, I want to suggest the ways that Ghassani's poetry speaks to each of these three ways of thinking about the relation between foreignness and home. And then I want to come back to what rereading through the lens of Morrison's work has offered me in thinking about Ghassani's. As the foreigner who speaks from the foreign place, Ghassani's poems turn at once on the promise of a home which can be named, to which one can lay claim, where one maintains essential relations and embodied experience, and to which one can return. Many, perhaps the majority of the poems in the collection could be described as love poems to Zanzibar, insistence that departure is not abandonment. To offer an illustrative couple of stanzas from the poem titled Naja Kwetu. Here it is. Naja niyaone yote ya kupwa na ya kujaa, ya chake chake na wete, ya pandani na wamba. Nami nionwe na wote, marafiki na jamaa, neema au fadhaa, ya kwetu ni yetu sote. Naja na naja kikweli, mwenda kwao si mtovu, naja na wala sijali, wapi palipo pabovu, naja na yangu akili, na elimu, na welevu, ni wajiao ni wangu, na mie pia ni wao. In some places, this leads to the expression of deep regret at having remade home in a new place. This next quote is from the author's preface to the poetry. Kila siku, kila saa, kila dakika, ndani ya kipindi chote hiki nimekuwa nikiishi kwenye mateso ya nafsi, ya kujiumiza na kujihoji mwenyewe. Daima nimekuwa nikijikosoa kwa kuamua kwangu kuacha kuishi maisha ya uenyeji nyumbani kwetu na kuradua kuishi maisha ya ugeni huku ugenini niliko. Hisia za mkosaji zimekuwa nami. In others of the poems and in his reflections on them in this preface, Ghassani also writes of a kind of disintegration before his eyes of this unimpeachable belonging of kuwa na kwetu. Some of this is explored through the figures of his children, who understand themselves in different relationship to this place of origin, who are on the one hand at home in Germany in a way he is not, and in another relegated to a state of foreignness in both places, étranger chez eux. He writes in the preface to the volume, nimewanyima ulimi wa nyumbani, ufasaha wa lugha ya Kiswahili, na nimewapa ulimi mwingine usiokatwa utata, lugha ya Kijerumani wanayokuwa nayo. Nimewanyima ujana nchi wa kujifakarishia na kwao ambako ndiko kwetu sote, na nimewapa utata wa kwao kwengine ambako hakika ni kugeni nao, kungawa ndiko uenjini kwao. The second way that foreignness comes home, as it were, is through Ghassani's memory of political alienation in the homeland itself, in which one's cultural and affective claims are subordinated to the administration of power, even when that power originates outside. Here he writes of his experience as a migrant from Pemba to the seat of Zanzibari government in Unguja. This is a bit cut off, but I'll read it to you anyway. Nilikuja kuhisi ukweli mchungu wa uhamaji na uhamiaji huo ndani ya nchi yangu mwenyewe, pale haki zangu za kiraia zinazofungamana na msimamo wangu wa kisiasa zilipoingia kati. Nilipofika mahala pa kutaka kutumia haki yangu ya kupiga kura kwenye chaguzi zote kuu na ndogo ndogo baina ya mwaka 2000 na mwaka 2010, nikajikuta kwa mara ya mwanzo na kumbushwa na wenye mamlaka ya chaguzi zenyewe kuwa mimi ni mhamiaji na haki hiyo haikuwa yangu. Here he quotes from the collection, from his own poem later in the collection, Kipande cha Kura. Basi sheha kainuka akaenda mwake bukini, majina limoandika akasema hanioni. Si wangu huyu hakika, katangaza hadharani, miaka yote tu jirani, bali akanikanuka. While many of Ghassani's poems seem to reify and enshrine the borders that define his claimed nation of Zanzibar in opposition to his lived foreignness in the West, this inclusion of his children's generation into the frame of reference and his vulnerability to neo-colonial power, even in Zanzibar, complicate this easy dichotomy between the Kwetu of remembered home and the ugenini of migrant life. For Morrison's part, this is tied to a broader African diasporic experience. She writes, African and African-American writers are not alone in coming to terms with these problems, but they do have a long and singular history of confronting them, of not being at home in their homeland, of being exiled in the place where they belong. By way of getting to my final point, I want to now go back to the beginning and describe two catalyzing moments in the context of that Toni Morrison symposium at the Africa Institute that brought me to thinking about these works together. First, in the course of the conversations of the symposium, as the terms foreigner, stranger, étranger came up again and again, I found my mind falling back on Kiswahili and idly attempting to translate these various titles. And I found I could not successfully do so. I could not rid the word mgeni of its sense of responsibility kupokea. Mgeni nyumbani inevitably carried the connotations of, if not an invitee, certainly one to whom welcome was owed. Carrying this realization forward, I realized that the ugenini of Ghassani's subtitle was not in fact only the foreign location of Germany from where his voice in this book emerged, but the state of being Mgeni, a state which needed, in order to fulfill itself fully, the possibility of reciprocity. The second catalyzing moment was an image which recurred repeatedly during the film of a stunning hand-drawn animation, here I have a still of it, of a migrant boat filled to overflowing with human figures, rocking in unstable seas. This is interspersed in the film with media footage and still photographs of overcrowded and capsized vessels filled with stranded and desperate African migrants. As I watched and listened, it was impossible to look on these images and not hear in my head Ghassani's stunning poem, Mifupa ya Muhajirina, sorry. I won't read the whole poem, but in this case, I'll read it a little bit in my English translation, and hopefully you can see here the original. Bones of the migrants. The water has receded, the shore but wet lumps of sand, shards of bone out in the open now, we see them. What's left of bodies tossed into the current when their boat went under, the dense, mature bones of men and women, and the slender ones of children, a community drowned in the Mediterranean Sea as they fled calamity, torture in Africa, killings in the Arab world, certain death in Asia, others seeking sustenance, the promise of Europe's comfort. What disappeared into the ocean, the ancestors have already named. It will make its way ashore, plain for all to see. Look at them. Look at the bones of the migrants spread along the shores of Europe. They didn't bury themselves or remain in the depths, but came to read us a message, testimony of the migrants, the ones who fled their homes, escaped disaster, believing they would see at least one day of grace for themselves, for their children at last. There, where the massive waves swallowed their voices, there where the fierce winds toppled their boats, there where the blackness of the sea engulfed them, mothers with their children, there at the furthest reach of brutality, the end of their journey, there where we stop up our ears so as not to hear their cries, where we shut our eyes so as not to see their wretchedness, there, yes, there, where they refuse to die. While this poem is a bit of an outlier in Ghassani's collection, the majority of the book is an exploration of his own experience as a different kind of migrant, not the kind fleeing calamity. It seems to me that the ways that this poem speaks to the other explorations of foreignness and home in the book and how it complicates and destabilizes the very title, Na Kwetu. Because as this poem tells us, these wretched ones too, walikuwa na makwao. This is where I find myself locating the deeper value of thinking about Ghassani's work alongside and through the lens of Toni Morrison's. And perhaps, if I can be so bold, it's what a Kiswahili and a Zanzibari lens from Ghassani might lend to Morrison's formulations. Morrison writes that, quote, the spectacle of mass movement draws attention inevitably to the borders, the poorest places, the vulnerable points where the concept of home is seen as being menaced by foreigners. But in Ghassani's poetry, indeed in Kiswahili at large, the condition of ugenini implies the responsibility of the mwenyeji. The two are inseparable. Mifupa ya muhajirina ends with the following stanza. Not numbers, but names. Humans, not beasts. These are people whose souls left them. This is life cut short, arrested breath. The bones of the migrants have debts they are owed. Who will pay them? What Morrison seems to implicitly understand, but perhaps needs Kiswahili to articulate, is that the influx of wageni does not make the mwenyeji estranged. Even as the mwenyekwao finds belonging amongst his own kin, it is the presence and possibility of wageni that makes uenyeji possible. The extreme case of the migrants who die at sea in Ghassani's poem illuminates a larger failure in the West to become wenyeji. The muhajirina in this poem are no less wenyekwao. Indeed, he seems to suggest that any of us, names, humans, souls, could find ourselves in such condition. But his insistence on their humanity would not be necessary in a world in which they were truly understood as wageni. Even in death, they are owed this debt of welcome. Thank you.
Mwanzo, asante sana Meg kwa wasilisho lako nzuri sana, asante sana. Natamani ningekuwa na muda zaidi wa kuzungumza. Swala la ugeni na wenyeji swala gumu na pana sana. Na hakuna mtu anayependa kuwa mgeni mahali fulani. Hata kama pale siku unapoishi siku ulikozaliwa, lakini bado upendelee kujulikana au kuhesabika kwamba wewe ni mgeni pale. Na hakuna mtu anayependa kutoka kwao, akenda kaishi kwingine ambako hahesabiki kwamba ni mwenyeji pale. Mimi mwenyewe na tajriba hiyo kwamba kwa miaka 22 nililazimika kuishi ugenini kwa sababu sikuweza kurudi nyumbani kwa sababu ya kisiasa. Na kuna msemo wa Kiswahili unasema mpigwa nje huenda kwao, mpigwa kwao endeni. Kwa hivyo mtu mara nyingi unakwenda kuishi ugenini si kwa hiari yako wewe, kwa sababu mazingira ya kukumba. Na hiyo ni shida ya binadamu. Maanake ukitizama sana, kwa nini kuwepo na vipingamizi vya mtu kuweza kutoka mahali kwenda akaishi mahali kwingine? Hasa katika sisi ambao kutokana na Uislamu. Katika Qur'ani tunaambiwa inna Allahi wasi'un fatwajibu fiha. Ulimwengu ni wa Mwenyezi Mungu, dunia ile ya Mwenyezi Mungu. Hamieni popote mnapotaka, ndio tunaambiwa katika Qur'ani. Hamieni popote mnapotaka. Sasa kwa hivyo ndio kuingia hii mambo utaifa na kadhalika na sheria za serikali. Hayo moja. Taarifa nilipotaka kutoa tu ni kwamba hii diwani ya Kwetu jana nilisema Mohammed Khelef Ghassani ameshaondoka. Kwamba washindi wetu wa kwanza katika hii tuzo ya Kiswahili ya mabati za mwanzo ilikuwa mabati Cornell, sasa ni Safari Cornell. Walikuwa mmoja alikuwa Mohammed Ghassani kwa upande wa ushahidi kwa diwani yake hii na Kwetu ndio iliyoshinda. Na kwa upande wa riwaya alikuwa ni jana alikuwa hapo Samuel Manyana.
Hayupo.
Leo hayupo, hajisikii vizuri. Kwa hivyo ilikuwa ni taarifa. Kwa hivyo utaona kwa nini nilichaguliwa ile ikawa ni mshindi kwa sababu ya diomo ndani. Na kwa bahati nzuri pia majaji wetu ndio shindano la kwanza kabisa la mabati Cornell. Walikuwa ni 6. Wawili katika 6, wawili wako hapa. Mmoja ni Profesa kutoka Lawi Mazuri. Ndio majaji wa kwanza katika tuzo katika shindano la kwanza la tuzo. Kwa kueleza taarifa hiyo.
Sijifungi na ushahidi tu, na niangalia katika muktadha wa Kiswahili na wenyeji wenyewe na wageni, kwa maana ya wale wanaozungumza Kiswahili kama lugha ya pili au ya tatu. Siku hizi wale wanaozungumza kama lugha ya kwanza, yaani lugha ya mama, tunaonekana kuwa ni kama ni wageni katika hiyo lugha. Watu wa lugha ya pili imekuwa wao wanajua zaidi kushinda wale wanaozungumza kwa mfano lahaja za Kiswahili ambao ndio wenye hiyo lugha. Kwa hivyo pengine uliwazie jambo hilo pia. Asante.
Back and forth. So where the languages do not stop talking to each other and nurturing each other in terms not only of language but concepts when you have them on the page and when you have them written on the page, but how this movement keeps on going and spurring this reflection. I mean, I have like in mind really like on a circle or a wave and just go back and forth and that's just a moment I'm impressed about this